Welcome to the deep dive. We've gotten some pretty cool sources from you for this episode.
Yeah.
Um, Textbook chapters, scientific diagrams, and even like some real world examples that really make you go, wait a minute, what am I seeing here? So our goal today is to really dive deep into all this stuff and
Yeah.
explore how our brains take in information about the world and then create
Yeah.
like your own reality, particularly through vision.
Yeah, it's a topic that has fascinated scientists and philosophers like forever,
Right.
really. And it continues to reveal these surprising insights about how our brains work.
We all kind of learned about the five senses back in school:
Mhm.
sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. But
Yeah.
our sources here are hinting that there's even more to it than just those five.
Absolutely. The five senses are a good starting point,
Right.
but they only scratch the surface, really.
Okay.
We also have senses like balance, which helps you stand upright,
Oh, right.
pain that alerts you to danger,
Mm.
and proprioception, which,
Because,
yeah, that one's a little less familiar.
yeah.
But it's basically your sense of like where your body is in space, even when your eyes are closed.
So it's not just about what we traditionally think of as the senses. It's like
Yeah.
a whole bunch more information that our brains
Right.
are always taking in.
Precisely, think about it. Like, how do you go from light waves
Oh,
bouncing off of objects to actually seeing
yeah.
a colorful world with depth?
Right.
It's more complex than it seems at first glance.
Yeah, it really is when you stop and think about it. It's
Yeah.
kind of like magic.
Well, scientists actually call the process that our brains use the inverse mapping problem.
Inverse mapping problem.
Yeah, imagine trying to recreate a 3D world from a flat 2D image.
Oh.
That's essentially what your brain is doing
Yeah.
all the time, taking the 2D images from your retinas and reconstructing a 3D understanding of everything around you.
That sounds really hard.
It is.
And yet we do it all the time without even thinking about it.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that our perception isn't always like a perfect
Oh.
representation of reality.
Okay.
Our brains sometimes take shortcuts
Uh-huh.
or make assumptions that lead to illusion.
Illusion.
Yeah, those moments where what you see
Right.
doesn't quite match up with what's actually there.
So it's like our brains are filling in the gaps, kind of,
Yeah.
making guesses based on what we've experienced before.
It's one way to think about it.
Okay.
Our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world
Right.
using the information they have, even if that means creating perceptions that aren't totally accurate.
Let's talk about some of those illusions,
Okay.
because you included some really cool examples.
Yeah,
One that caught my eye was the Knissa triangle.
right.
It's just like a bunch of Pac-Man shapes and lines,
Uh-huh.
but you actually see a triangle that's not really there.
It's a classic example of how our brains complete incomplete information. You see a triangle because your visual system is wired to look for patterns and familiar shapes.
Right.
It's so powerful that it can even create the illusion of contours where none exist.
So our brains aren't just passively receiving information, they're actively constructing
Right.
what we see.
Exactly. And this active construction process actually begins before the information even gets to your brain.
Oh, really?
The cells in your eyes, specifically those in the retina,
Uh-huh.
do a lot of processing and
There
filtering.
was another illusion, the Hermann grid,
Yes.
that shows this, what's happening there?
The Hermann grid with those gray dots that pop up at the intersections of the white lines shows how cells in the retina
Okay.
interact with each other.
Right.
And it's a phenomenon called lateral inhibition.
Lateral inhibition.
Yeah, where cells responsible for detecting edges and contrast suppress the activity of their neighboring cells.
Oh, interesting.
This helps sharpen our perception of edges, but also creates those weird gray dots.
So even at this basic level, our visual system isn't just sending information, but also shaping it,
Exactly.
like highlighting some parts and suppressing others.
It's like an artist sketching the basic outlines of a scene before filling in all the details.
Okay.
Our visual system starts by enhancing contrast and detecting edges, and then uses that information to build a more complete picture.
Let's add some color to this now.
Okay.
You included information about the trichromatic and opponent process theories
Right.
of color vision. Can you explain how those help us understand how we see color?
Sure. The trichromatic theory explains how our eyes actually detect color.
Okay.
It proposes that we have three types of color receptors called cones,
Cones?
in our retinas, that are each sensitive to a different range of wavelengths of light:
Okay.
red, green, and blue.
So like mixing paint?
Just like mixing paints. These three primary colors can be combined in different proportions to create the full spectrum of colors that we see.
So the trichromatic theory explains how we detect the different colors. But how do our brains actually process and interpret that information?
That's where the opponent process theory comes in.
Okay.
It suggests that color information from the cones is then processed in opposing pairs.
Oh.
Red versus green and blue versus yellow.
Okay.
These color pairs are fundamentally opposed in our perception, which is why you never see reddish green or bluish yellow.
It's kind of like a seesaw.
It is.
One color goes up, the other one goes down.
Yeah, and those weird color after effects,
Right.
like when you stare at a red image for too long and then everything looks green,
Yeah.
those after images are a great example of the opponent process theory in action.
Oh, cool.
When you stare at a red image, you fatigue the red sensitive cells in your retina.
Mm.
Then when you look at a white surface, the green sensitive cells, which haven't been fatigued,
Okay.
are more active. And that's why you see a green after image.
So we've covered how our brains figure out brightness and color from light.
Uh-huh.
But I'm curious how we go from these flat images on our retinas to seeing the world in 3D. How do we perceive depth?
That's another remarkable thing our visual system can do.
Right.
Our brains use a variety of cues,
Yeah.
some based on information from just one eye and others that require both eyes working together.
Okay.
These are called monocular and binocular cues.
Monocular and binocular.
Yeah, let's start with the monocular cues,
Okay.
because these are the ones artists use to create the illusion of depth in
Mhm.
paintings and drawings.
Like using linear perspective to make things further away look smaller,
Exactly.
or using overlapping objects to show which ones are in front.
Exactly. And you included some really cool examples
Yeah.
of how these monocular cues can be, like, manipulated to create optical illusions.
Right.
The Ames room, for instance, distorts our perception of size by playing with our assumptions about perspective and distance.
So people look like they're shrinking or growing.
Yeah, even though they stay the same size.
Yeah.
It's a cool illustration of how our brains constantly rely on contextual clues
Right.
to make sense of what we're seeing.
And those cues can sometimes mislead us. Another illusion you included was the Ponzo illusion,
Uh-huh.
where two lines of the same length look different sizes because of converging lines in the background.
Right. The converging lines in the Ponzo illusion create a sense of perspective,
Oh, okay.
making our brains perceive the top line as further away and therefore larger.
Even though it's the same length as the bottom line.
Exactly.
It shows how our perception of size is always relative
Yeah.
and influenced by the context around it.
Right.
So even though these illusions are tricking us, they're
Ah.
also revealing how our brains work.
Absolutely. Illusions are like windows into how our visual system works.
Oh, cool.
They help us understand the assumptions and shortcuts
Okay.
that our brains use to construct our perception of the world.
So we've covered some of the monocular cues.
Yeah.
What about binocular cues?
Okay, so binocular cues provide even more precise information about depth,
Uh-huh.
especially for objects that are close to us.
Okay.
One important one is called convergence.
Convergence.
Yeah, when you focus on an object,
Right.
your eyes rotate inward, and the angle of that convergence
Mm.
tells your brain how far away the object is.
So the closer something is, the more our eyes have to converge.
Exactly. It's like our eyes are acting as a rangefinder,
Oh.
using that angle to figure out the distance.
Okay, cool. And what about stereopsis?
So stereopsis, or stereoscopic vision,
Yeah.
is the other key binocular cue.
Okay.
Because our eyes are slightly apart, they each get a slightly different image of the world.
Right.
Your brain compares these two images and uses those tiny differences to create a sense of depth.
It's like having two cameras taking pictures from slightly different angles.
Exactly. That's how 3D movies work.
Oh, right.
They present slightly different images to each eye, mimicking the disparity our eyes receive in real life
Okay.
and enhancing that illusion of depth.
So we've explored how our brains figure out brightness and color and depth.
Yeah.
But there's another important piece we haven't talked about yet, motion perception.
Oh, that's right. Motion perception is crucial for survival. It lets us move around, avoid danger, and interact with the world.
Yeah.
And just like other parts of vision,
Mm-hmm.
our perception of motion is subject to some really interesting illusions
Okay.
that reveal a lot about how our brains process movement.
This is getting really interesting.
Yeah.
But we're also at the end of part 1 of this deep dive. I
Okay.
can't wait to keep going and learn about motion perception in part 2.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to the deep dive. In part 1, we explored how our brains create this visual reality,
Right.
from perceiving brightness and color to understanding depth.
Uh-huh.
Now let's get into motion perception.
Okay.
It might seem simple at first. Things move, we see them move,
Right.
but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, motion perception is this complex process that involves these special cells in our brains.
Oh, wow.
and some pretty cool illusions.
Okay, so how does our brain actually detect motion?
Well, our sources say that our brains have these things called motion detectors.
Motion detect.
Yeah, they're like tiny little sensors that analyze changes in an object's position over time.
Hmm.
They're constantly monitoring how the images on our retinas are shifting,
Okay.
and then they calculate the speed and direction of that movement.
So, like, if I'm watching a car drive down the street,
Yeah,
are these motion detectors firing off signals as the car's image moves across my retina?
exactly. Those motion detectors are working hard,
Okay.
helping your brain track the car's movement. But what's really interesting is that these detectors don't just respond to real physical movement.
Oh.
They can also be activated by something called apparent motion.
Apparent motion.
Yeah,
That's the illusion of movement we get from still images, right?
exactly like those old flip books where you flip through the pages
Yeah.
and it looks like the drawings are moving.
That's so cool.
Your brain interprets those rapidly changing static images as continuous motion.
Even though it's an illusion.
Right, and it's the same principle behind movies and animation.
It really is.
It's amazing how our brains stitch together those individual frames
Right.
to create this fluid experience.
That's like magic.
Yeah, but there's also this thing called the aperture problem.
Aperture problem.
Yeah, which makes things a bit more complicated.
Okay, what's that?
The aperture problem happens because our motion detectors have these tiny receptive fields.
Receptive fields.
Yeah, they're like little windows that they see the world through.
Huh.
Each detector only sees a small part of the overall motion, and that can sometimes be confusing.
Confusing how?
Like imagine trying to figure out which way a car is moving, but just looking at one of its wheels
Okay.
through a tiny hole.
Right.
You might not be able to tell if it's going forward, backward, or even sideways.
So each motion detector only has a limited view,
Exactly.
and they have to work together to figure out the whole picture.
Right, and that's where the aperture problem comes in.
Okay.
These local motion detectors, with their limited views,
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes be fooled,
Mm.
which leads to some pretty cool visual illusions.
One of the illusions you included was the barber pole illusion.
Oh, yeah.
That one always gets me.
It's a classic.
Can you explain how it works?
Sure, so picture a barber pole with those diagonal stripes.
Yeah.
Now, because of the aperture problem, the motion detectors that are focused on the stripes,
Uh-huh.
they only see the stripes moving up or down.
But we know the pole isn't actually growing or shrinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our brains have to do something to make sense of those conflicting signals.
Right.
Your brain integrates information from multiple motion detectors
Oh.
to figure out what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
It combines those local motion signals with other cues to resolve the ambiguity.
And perceive the true motion of the barber pole.
Exactly.
So our brains are always like doing this complicated dance behind the scenes, trying to figure out how things are moving.
Right, and it's not just about detecting motion. It's also about adapting to all this constant visual information.
Okay.
A really interesting example of this is motion after effects.
Like the waterfall illusion.
Exactly. You stare at a waterfall for a while, then look at the rocks next to it,
Right.
and suddenly the rocks look like they're moving upward.
It's so weird.
Our visual system adapts to that prolonged exposure to downward motion.
Okay.
When you stare at the waterfall, the motion detectors that are sensitive to downward movement,
Yeah.
they get tired.
So those downward motion detectors are taking a break,
Yeah, and then the upward motion detectors become more active.
making the stationary rocks look like they're moving up.
Exactly. It's like a seesaw. One
Right.
side goes down, the other side goes up.
Our brains are so adaptable.
They are constantly recalibrating.
Based on what we've been seeing.
Right. Even when the world is still unning, our brains can create a sense of motion.
That's incredible. So we've talked about how our brains use motion detectors to see both real and apparent motion,
Yeah.
how the aperture problem can trick our brains, and how motion after effects show us how adaptable our visual system is.
Right.
But this is just one part of how we perceive the world.
Absolutely. We've been focusing on vision.
Right.
But our brains don't just process information from one sense at a time.
Oh, okay.
All of our senses work together,
Really?
constantly sharing information and influencing each other.
This interplay between the senses is called
Multi-sensory integration.
multisensory integration. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
I'm excited to explore how our brains combine all this sensory information.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring how our brains create visual reality from light and color to depth and motion. But now get ready because we're about to enter the world of multisensory integration.
It's an area of research that's really changing how we think about perception.
Yeah, for a long time, scientists studied the senses in isolation,
Yeah.
but now we're realizing how interconnected they really are.
Right.
It makes you wonder why we even talk about like five senses
Yeah.
when it's really this like web of information going on in our brain.
It's a simplification for
Yeah.
sure. But it doesn't really capture the full picture of how our brains actually work.
Right.
Think about it in everyday life. You're rarely experiencing just one sense at a time. You're
Right.
seeing, hearing, feeling, maybe even smelling and tasting all at once.
Right.
Your brain has to take all that information and combine it into a coherent experience.
One example of this that you included was the McGurk effect.
Yeah.
It shows how what we see can actually change what we hear.
The McGurk effect is a classic example. You see someone saying one syllable,
Uh-huh.
but the audio is a different syllable.
Okay.
And what you perceive is a third syllable altogether,
Wow.
a combination of what you see and hear.
It's like my brain is trying to make sense of those conflicting cues and like coming up with a compromise.
Yeah.
But why does vision dominate in this case?
That's a good question. There are a few possible explanations.
Okay.
One is that visual information, especially lip movements,
Right.
gives us more precise timing information than audio signals.
Yep.
Another idea is that our brains have evolved to prioritize visual cues in speech
Right.
because we often rely on lip reading in noisy environments.
That makes sense if I'm at a party trying to understand someone,
Yeah.
watching their lips really helps.
Exactly. And it shows how flexible our perception can be. Our brains are always weighing different sensory cues,
Okay.
depending on what's most reliable at any given time.
Another illusion that shows this connection between vision and sound is the ventriloquist effect.
Right, the ventriloquist makes the puppet appear to be talking.
Yeah.
Our brains tend to link sound with the most obvious visual source,
Mm-hmm.
even if that's not where the sound is really coming from.
So we see the dummy's mouth moving.
Yeah.
And we just assume that's where the voice is coming from.
Even though we know it's the ventriloquist doing the talking.
It's like our brain's taking a shortcut.
Yeah, it's a clever trick that plays on how our brains combine senses.
Right. Our brains want the simplest explanation.
Yeah.
And in this case, the dummy's mouth moving is a strong visual cue.
Exactly.
That overrides where the sound is actually coming from.
It's a good example of how vision can sometimes be more dominant.
You also mentioned the rubber hand illusion.
Oh yeah, that one's a classic too.
It's where you see a fake hand being stroked,
Yeah.
and your real hand is hidden but also being stroked.
Right.
And then your brain starts to feel like that rubber hand is your own.
It shows how visual information can change our sense of body ownership.
Wow.
Your brain sees the rubber hand being touched at the same time as your real hand.
Mm,
And it starts to include that visual information into your body schema.
body schema.
Yeah, it's like the map your brain has of your body.
So it's like my brain is saying, well, if it looks like my hand and it feels like my hand, then it must be my hand.
Exactly. And the rubber hand illusion is just one example of how our sense of touch can be affected by other senses.
Right.
There's also evidence that what we see can influence how we perceive temperature.
Really?
For example, if you see a blue light, you might feel colder, even if the temperature hasn't changed.
That's wild. It seems like our brains are constantly mixing information from different senses.
They are. It creates a much richer experience than just using one sense at a time.
Right, and this multisensory integration isn't just some random thing.
No, it's actually important for survival.
Okay.
By combining information from different senses, our brains create a more accurate and reliable picture of the world.
That makes sense, like if you're trying to find a predator in the dark,
Yeah,
using both hearing and vision would be really helpful.
exactly. And this is happening all the time without us even realizing it.
It's pretty amazing.
It's a remarkable feat of neural engineering.
We've talked a lot about illusions, but you also included synesthesia,
Yeah,
where one sense triggers experiences in another sense?
right.
This isn't an illusion, though, right?
No, synesthesia is a real neurological phenomenon.
Okay.
The lines between the senses get blurred.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might experience sounds as colors,
Right.
or taste shapes,
Wow.
or see numbers as having personalities.
It's like having an extra dimension to your senses.
Yeah, and it tells us something about how perception works.
What does it tell us?
It shows how adaptable our brains are
Oh.
and the connections that can exist between different senses.
So this deep dive into perception has been quite a journey.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We've explored how our brains create our visual world,
Uh-huh.
how we see motion, and how our senses work together.
Right.
to create this amazing experience of reality.
And what's really cool is that we've only scratched the surface.
There's still so much we don't know.
There is so much more to explore.
What are some of the big questions scientists are still trying to figure out?
One of the big ones is how all these sensory processes lead to our conscious experience.
That's just experience.
Yeah, how do we go from electrical signals in our brains to the feeling of the sun on our skin or the taste of chocolate?
Right.
How does the brain create that subjective feeling of our experiences?
Those are big questions.
They are.
Do you think studying illusions could help us understand consciousness better?
It's definitely possible.
Okay.
Illusions show us the gaps in our perception,
Right.
where our brains make assumptions and take shortcuts.
Mm-hmm.
By understanding how our brains create these illusions, we might learn more about how consciousness works.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listener?
I hope they've learned how complex and amazing their senses are.
Yeah.
The world you experience isn't just a reflection of what's out there.
Okay.
It's actively created by your brain.
Wow.
Your brain is always taking information from your senses, filtering it, interpreting it, and creating meaning.
And sometimes that creates some pretty cool illusions.
Exactly. It's a testament to the power of our brains.
So to our listener, the next time you see a sunset or hear your favorite song or taste something delicious,
Yeah.
take a moment to appreciate what's happening inside your brain.
It's an incredible process.
It really is. And remember, there's always more to discover.
Absolutely. Keep questioning, keep observing, and keep exploring.
That's a perfect way to end this. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into human perception. Until next time, keep exploring